Our special guest today is Otak Conroy Ben. She's an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. Did I say that okay?
Yes.
She's an associate professor of environmental engineering at Arizona State University, and her research efforts include water and wastewater pollution, wastewater based epidemiology, and environmental justice. I was sharing just before we started the program uh, my interest in one of the papers that she's produced. She's published quite a bit, and we're going to hope to get into some of those topics for this session because it has to do with mining and the effects of mining pollution-wise with the arsenic and uranium and the concentration of those chemicals in certain populations and demographics. So before we get too far, Otak, thank you for joining us today. And as I shared with you when we spoke back in January, I'd love to hear about who you are and how you've come to this role and maybe how you've come to focus on this particular domain of research.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my work. I understand this is a great program that's going on in the community college regions in Phoenix and the rest of Arizona. So I'm hoping that our conversation will be meaningful and impactful and informative for the viewers. So, as you stated, my name's Otakuye Conroy Ben. My Lakota name is Titakuye Otawi. That means woman with many relatives. I come from a reservation in South Dakota, which is historically, lower on the socioeconomic side, suffer from poverty, a lot of health, adverse health impacts, perhaps due to environmental pollution, but we're also very rich culturally. And I think that's really helped me navigate, education and career and, persevere through certain hard times recently that we've been going through. I received my bachelor's degree in chemistry. I felt like throughout my life, I've always been scientifically focused. That's where my strength comes from. And after studying chemistry, I went on to graduate school, which really helped shape what I do today. I went to graduate school at the University of Arizona, just down in Tucson. I joined a research group where they were looking at reusing wastewater as a water source. And this was the early 2000s. It was kind of a new concept back then. And there were a lot of unanswered questions. Some of the questions included, well, what are the pollutants present in wastewater and how can we clean them up for reuse? Maybe not potable reuse, so that's ingesting the water, but could we perhaps recharge our groundwater or use the water as an irrigation source? So that was my research, looking at pollutants in wastewater, specifically biologically active pollutants. These pollutants I focused on were endocrine disrupting chemicals. So these are pollutants not removed during wastewater treatment, but they're known to interact with the endocrine system of different animals. I was studying specifically estrogen and androgen pollutants. So I started that research over 20 years ago. I still do it today. We're looking at endocrine disrupting chemicals still in wastewater, now in biosolids. And I guess my focus has expanded into looking at microbes, antimicrobial resistant genes, the forever chemicals, PFAS, heavy metals, basically anything that can pose to be problematic when it comes to exposure, not only for the environment, but for animals and humans.
Thank you. You generated a couple questions for me, so if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little follow-up. If it's okay, could you explain to me, you mentioned that the culture dimension as you were growing up and even now is a really important part of your system. Your name means woman with many relatives. Is that tie together? Is it those family bonds and the community bonds that you're referring to?
I would say so. I like to joke that I'm related to everyone on my reservation. I think I am through both sides of the family. But that, my name really does tie into family and community. And, we talk about Native Americans leaving the reservation and never going back. But through my work, I'm able to get back. And I really want to serve not only my community, but perhaps other areas that are underserved.
Mm, okay. Sounds like a really important part of your identity and of your success, that it's a support system, and you're interested as well as providing back into that support system to be there for others as well. So thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned this issue of uh, polluted water, and you referenced the idea of potentially looking at the reuse. I think that you mentioned this was at your University of Arizona work, and you mentioned potentially recharging the groundwater. And I'm curious, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but I'm just curious: is there an issue with plant take up of these chemicals, of these thinking of arsenic, for example? Are these systemic into the plant that then would become problematic for cattle grazing or sheep grazing or plant production?
Yeah, so I mean, you could think of that as another dimension to pollution. But in some of my work and a lot of other work, plants are actually being used for bioremediation or phytoremediation to take up some of those pollutants and extract them from water. But yes, there is that problem that gets me thinking about the Navajo reservation, where there's a lot of uranium pollution. And uranium is showing up in vegetation, the livestock that is managed by the different communities can take up that vegetation, and the uranium is actually showing back up in different animals. So it has its, pros and cons, right? We can use plants to alleviate the problem. It's been shown to reduce pollutant levels when it comes to wastewater wetlands. But we have to be mindful that what is the end product use of these plants? What's going to happen to them?
Does the plant become? I'm thinking of lead. We have lead issues in our waters here in central Pennsylvania, and what I've understood is that any sort of lead input into the water gets consumed by microorganisms, get consumed by fish. Eagles eat fish, ospreys eat fish, and then we see the lead showing up. In particular, eagles, for some reason, are the bald eagle seems to be susceptible to this. So it's aggregated in the food chain into the final product, if you will, being the fish, which the bird consumes. Is it a similar issue in plants? Does it work kind of the same way?
Oh, yes, definitely. So, what you're referring to is bioaccumulation, and it is a problem with heavy metals. So, metals cannot be in some cases they can, but heavy metals just get transferred from one phase to another. They can't be broken down,
Mm.
and so you'll start to see as we go up the food chain, um, you'll see that accumulation of metals. You'll actually see accumulation of some other pollutants besides metals. But there are some, well-known studies. There's some environmental texts that do report that bioaccumulation all the way up to, the predatory level.
Well, and I've got to think that humans are part of that cycle, right? We're the apex predator, if you will, of beef, dairy, corn production, whatever it might be. So I can certainly see where downstream, as you might say, the effects are going to show up in some ways. I wanted to kind of transition to that point. Then you talked about endocrine. Oh, I one other question. Does uranium lose, as it goes through that aggregation process, does it lose its radioactivity at all? I think they're called isotopes, do they change or break down through that process, or do they still remain as lethal or as toxic?
Yeah, so uranium chemistry is very complex.
Mm.
Uranium itself is a regulated drinking water contaminant, even in non-radioactive forms. So radioactivity does decay. It just really depends on which isotopes of uranium we're dealing with and which decay chain it goes through. So we can see loss of radioactivity, but we could also just see transfer of that radioactivity to another chemical. But uranium itself is a heavy metal, and we're still, looking at ways to remove uranium, particularly from areas in Arizona where it's found in a lot of drinking water sources.
So, and these are all for me sort of preface questions to getting into the biological effects. But is if you were to go into an area that had not been disturbed, hadn't been mined or maybe even farmed or such, would you expect to find these heavy metals naturally occurring in the soils or in the water system, or is it only a kind of upon disruption that they become problematic?
No, you can find many of these chemicals naturally, especially if you have a groundwater source. Just the weathering of minerals in the earth coming in
Mm,
contact with groundwater, you'll have natural leaching of the chemical into the water source. So when we're looking at water quality, it's important to identify what that water source is. Is it groundwater? Is it surface water? Or is it groundwater under the impact of surface water? They have two very different chemistries going on, or chemical profiles.
okay.
That tells us how we can treat it.
Okay. And I'm going to presume, and so correct me if I'm wrong, that water is an important part of the mining of these heavy metals. How is that? How does that occur? Is it a washing agent, or is it a?
I'm not too familiar with the mining process, but
Mm,
mined water can be used to make slurries just for the transport of, coal, crushed ore, crushed rock. Um, the mining water, wastewater can be generated through the extraction process. So when you're leaching out the metal from the ore, then you generate wastewater. So when it comes to mining, we're dealing both with the use of natural water sources, which can be, a bit of a political issue,
mm,
and then the generation of some pretty toxic wastewater that we have to deal with.
mm. Wow. Multiple sources, and as you said, just a complication of chemistry
Yep.
and how these things occur. So let's transition then to that the effect. What happens when you say biological systems, or we're talking of primarily of humans or perhaps animals as well, subjects. But what are the kinds of things that you see occurring? Probably not good, I'm guessing.
No, they're not good. But I think the picture is not as bleak as a lot of people make it out to be.
Hmm.
So, in my work, I'm looking at using different bioassays to test for the activity of water. So, I can take a water sample, extract out the chemicals, and then test them in some type of microbial test to see if it will light up a gene, for example. And, in that way, we can get some valuable information without having to go to like animal studies. Um, we also look at genes present in environmental samples, microbial genes, are there antibiotic resistant genes? I do have colleagues who do those animal tests where they'll take a water sample and see what happens to zebrafish, for example.
Mhm.
So when I talk about, the biological effects, we really want to see what's happening to living systems.
So you mentioned a couple times this microbial level. Um, is that a potential resource? And I don't know. You said before these metals really don't break down. So do the microbes don't necessarily break them into component uh, chemicals? I'm not very good with chemistry, so I'm going to probably stop there. But how could, like, I'm thinking, could the microbes be used as a way to lessen the levels of arsenic, uranium, and probably every other heavy metals? Or is that really not how it works?
No, they can be. So again, with metals, we can transform them into different species, but the metal will always remain there.
Okay.
Where microbes can come in, microbes can mediate that process. So they can change it's called redox chemistry. So it can oxidize a metal or reduce a metal.
Mm.
Microbes can also uptake metals. So we are removing them from the liquid side. Microbes can also be engineered to do those biotransformation or bioaccumulation processes.
So you got me thinking here now. As you do bioaccumulation through the microbes, you don't want that going higher up into the food chain, right? You kind of want to stop it there. So, can you literally stop the process with the microbes and capture them and store them in a safe manner? Is that a possibility?
Oh, yes.
Huh.
Yeah, so on the engineering side, we can construct bioreactors where the microbes, eat up, take up whatever they can, and then we physically remove the microbes.
Hmm.
Um, Microbes can also generate, non-metal products where the final non-metal product interacts with the metal to precipitate it out of solution.
Huh. Okay. So it's almost, it sounds to me like a filter of sorts.
Yeah.
And in the end, you capture the waste of that, and then you're able, but it's a tangible thing. You can see the sludge or
Mhm.
whatever. I'm going to guess that can be dried or somehow contained and then stored separate from the. Does it work for everything, all of the heavy metals, or just some? And the other question I have is, are they naturally occurring? Do the Are they already, the microbes? Are they already in the soils and in the waters, or is that an introduced
For the most case, for the most of the cases I've seen, there are naturally occurring
element?
bacteria that have adapted to that climate. So I'm
Oh,
currently working with Arizona Department of Environmental Quality on remediation of some mining waste streams. Part of that work is we're looking to identify those microbes that can grow in a metal-rich environment. We call them metal-resistant bacteria. So we're trying to identify those, and then we're going to see if we can use them in the remediation process.
I see. Interesting. Now let's go to the impact. What happens when you mentioned the endocrine system in particular? I'm going to imagine we're talking about a pituitary gland, we're talking about thyroids, other very, very sensitive parts of our bodies to these metals. Is that what's happening?
Yes. So I don't do whole organism studies, but there are many reported observational studies, in vivo studies where a pollutant will generate some type of adverse effect. When it comes to endocrine disruption, that's disrupting the thyroid system. There's a lot of evidence where there's feminization of aquatic animals,
Hmm.
induction of cancers of different systems. People are now looking into metabolic disruptors that may impact how we metabolize lipids, Does it impact our cardiovascular health? So the endocrine system, covers all parts of our body.
Right, right.
Yeah, so heavy metals are involved, organic pollutants, inorganic pollutants.
Mm.
And now we have this new class of forever chemicals that's being regulated by EPA. In our work, we're showing that it's disrupting the thyroid system primarily.
So historically, I don't know, I'll just say 100 years now that we've been doing something in these lands with these chemicals. What did they see in populations who were, you know, affected by the water that they needed to drink and use and bathe in and wash and so forth? What did we see back then? Is there a trail of evidence that these chemicals and all were having an effect?
Yeah, so when it comes to human, there are some known observational studies with regards to arsenic.
Mm.
Over in the Bangladesh region of the world, it was observed that high levels of arsenic were causing cancers, and that was known. And as a result, the um, Safe Drinking Water Act level was reduced. This was the early mid 2000s.
Oh, okay.
Um, EPA reduced the allowable levels of arsenic that could be present in our water because it's a known carcinogen. And we're starting to see that, with the new regulation on the forever chemicals, EPA is required every 5 years to look at 30 new chemicals under the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, just to see if they're present in US drinking water. Um, and the motivation is because some of these chemicals can adversely impact living organisms.
Right, right. I would imagine, like, I only know a little bit about the lead issue that the country has dealt with in various locations, but
Mhm.
lead's also a heavy metal. I'm going to guess that it has kind of the same impact um, on the system. And you spoke of, I think lead is actually highly related to cognitive um,
Yes,
impact. I don't know. I would have guessed the other ones, like you said, it's systemic. It has an impact all over the body.
yes, you're correct.
Where in then geographically do you see these pockets of um, disruptions, if you will, or the health outcomes of populations who are impacted by these? As I mentioned earlier, some of the research you're looking at have a socioeconomic dimension to them. So you are examining, and that's kind of starts to get at what our students are and faculty members, as they write these assignments, will be tuning into
Mhm.
is how um, where might these occur, and then I'd like to follow that up in a bit with how do we know, or are there signs, or are there things we can be looking at? But maybe start with the geographic part. Where do you see those chemicals showing up?
Right. So if we're looking at heavy metals, you're going to find heavy metals in water sources that are pulling from groundwater. So here in the Southwest, where we do have, water limitations, you might see more of that practice in certain regions. Um, I would say where there's some mining, you're going to see those heavy metal impacts. I saw some studies from Central California looking at maybe nitrate,
Mm.
not a heavy metal, but an inorganic chemical that can be linked to thyroid problems, thyroid cancer, thyroid abnormalities, and so forth.
So to the groundwater question, then, I mean, these are deep wells to tap into the aquifer at that level. How are these chemicals? again, are they sort of like naturally in the water system and then going into a well, or are they an output or a result of mining or some other disruption, or is it maybe a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. I would say that, our water cycle is all tied together.
Mm,
You're going to get influence from surface water, perhaps agricultural runoff, wastewater discharges, mining activities, as well as naturally occurring minerals found in the subsurface.
it's kind of like a double whammy then.
Yes.
It has to be devastating for these communities. We had one other guest a couple weeks ago who mentioned that, as they look at water quality in remote farms, for example, that the individuals have no other option. There aren't water trucks coming in, or this is the water that they feed their livestock with. It's the water they use every day. They're exposed to it every place they turn around, and I would imagine they're having some of these health issues are showing up in those populations as well. Um, when you're when you're doing this research, or when you talk a little bit about the socioeconomic dimension of it, how do you uh, kind of classify the geography around socioeconomic, and then that question of when you do that classification, do you see certain populations that have higher exposure and higher health issues from exposure?
Yeah, so I think it's important to really look at the data and where you're getting that data from. So when I look at the relationships between, environmental justice and disease and,
Mhm.
um, demographics and so forth, I tend to refer to EPA. So EPA has the EJ screen, the environmental justice screen, which lays out all the demographics based on census data. And then that can be overlain with air pollution, proximity to Superfund sites, water quality. Um, so that information is publicly available.
Okay.
I think it's probably not easily accessible to the general public.
Mm.
So that's where researchers come in and try to make sense of the data, and try to, get that information back out there. By law, the utilities, anyone that generates waste does have to make all of this data available to nearby users if perhaps there's an exceedance of a pollutant in drinking water.
Okay. So, just a tangent here for a second, only because you mentioned it and it raised a question. Do these heavy metals present in air quality? Do they form? I mean, are they in the air that we breathe as well, or they're so heavy that they're not able to be carried as a particulate in the air?
So when it comes to air quality, there are some regulated air pollutants. Um, so those would be like carbon monoxide, nitrogen, sulfur. Um, Lead is a regulated air pollutant. And then when it comes, yes. So when it comes to combustion of any type of fuel, could be
Oh,
coal, diesel, petroleum, gasoline. If there are any heavy metal impurities, those can become airborne um, as free floating metals or attached to particulates.
do we
Um,
do we see then an increase? We talked about a couple biological systems that are impacted. Do we also see increases, say, in lung cancer um, for these individuals in these populations, or is that less prevalent?
That's less prevalent, I would say, with environmental regulations since the 1970s. the targeted pollution, targeted removal of lead from gasoline additives. It's regulated drinking water. So we're seeing less of that nowadays, but
Yeah.
many decades ago, it was a problem.
Now that you're saying it, I'm thinking back to the lead issue in homes, in particular with using lead paint.
Mhm.
And I remember reading that it is also the dust. So it's any disturbance. I think in some cases the children were eating a
Yeah.
paint chip or something, but as they go to remove that pollutant, it also generates dust. And I'd forgotten the fact that heavy metals can also be in the air. That's an interesting aspect of it. So as you look at the data, you're looking at these communities, you've got sort of these classifications, you're using the EPA work. How do you then follow up with the health dimension? How do you get access to that data? Because that, I'm going to guess, would be a different data set than what EPA tracks.
So I'm more familiar with the environmental side.
Okay.
On the health side, there is that environmental justice screen, and within that app, it can take you to cancer occurrences, life expectancy. But I would say that another place to look is Center for Disease Control, where they are required to document health ailments at the population level.
Okay. So some of this data, like you said, might be kind of hard for a faculty student team to get to the level of granularity to find these minute, and that's probably beyond the scope, I'm going to guess, of this project. So I'm thinking through a little bit of what are the kinds of um, variables or data points that we can look at that a student. So, for example, I'll just give you an example. One of our guests was speaking of diet and the impact of nutrition on populations and access to fresh food and such. And so we kind of brainstormed a half dozen easily identified metrics that you can look at and say, oh, does this community have fresh food supermarkets and so forth? I'm having a little harder time in this domain because of what you mentioned, access to that data is typically, and it, as I said, it may be beyond the scope of this project. In the assignment, the faculty member and student team are generating an experience for a class, and in that experience, they are hoping to create an awareness among the students of the health inequities in their communities, home communities. So that's a fairly broad, and it is STEAM. It's not just STEM.
Mhm.
So it does pull in the humanities. So I'm thinking of, are there things that we could be encouraging the faculty student teams to be thinking about in terms of the pollution dimension or pollutants dimensions in their communities? That's one question I have. The other one is, do these pollutants show up on, I don't have a better way of asking it, but in affluent locations, communities that, for whatever reason, have more money? Like, is water filtered or prepared differently in different communities at all? Or
So, going back to your first question about, I guess, data access. I would say that, faculty, students can easily access this data
okay,
on water pollution. Utilities do have to make that information public to all of its users. I would say where there might be a disconnect is, so say we have all this water quality data. At that point, we really can't say there's a definitive a connection between a pollutant and a health ailment.
Mhm.
Simply because we can't do a lot of human studies, um, but then it just brings up a lot of like legal issues on top of
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
And your second question, remind me again.
Second question had to do with the where might we look? What are some of those indicators that, okay, like, the food supermarket one is kind of big and obvious. Oh, we can go in and we can count the number of those or lack of those. Help me think through a little bit. Are there things that we can point to students to in these communities that might be indicators? Oh, I know what I asked you, Otak. I was asking about, um, are there differences in water
Mhm.
management
Yes.
around these meadows?
Yes. So I was thinking about just the Phoenix metropolitan area. Do more affluent neighborhoods,
Hmm.
do they have environmental issues? So Phoenix metropolitan area has a number of Superfund sites. So these are historically polluted with hazardous waste. Um, and there are a number of sites here, which is quite alarming, a little scary.
Hmm.
But there are two sites located in affluent areas. They're located in Scottsdale.
Hmm.
Um, and just a few miles away, there's another Superfund site located in Central Phoenix, where it's a poorer community. So this pollution problem affects everyone. On the management side, um, a larger city is going to have more resources
Hmm.
to perhaps clean up that water. Whereas if we go into tribal communities, they are resource limited. They have priorities and a set budget to address
Hmm.
certain issues, and they may not be staffed to operate a nice, state of the art drinking water or wastewater facility. So you do see some disparities when it comes to the actual, implementation of delivering a healthy environment.
Is there any feasibility from those water treatment facilities assessing the kinds of pollutants that they are able to deal with? I mean, is that one thing that a lesson assignment might include? Visiting a water facility plant and getting the list of chemicals that they filter for, they manage for.
I mean, definitely. I think I love water and wastewater treatment facilities. It'd be great to see, what a large facility looks like, what a small facility looks like.
Mm.
But in the end, all these facilities have to obey by EPA rules.
Mm.
So we do anticipate that, clean water is getting delivered to a tribal nation. Um,
Mm.
they may have to deal with different water quality. Different techniques may be employed,
Mm.
but in the end, we all have to have that same level of clean drinking water. It doesn't always happen, but um,
That's sort
that's
of the
the
goal.
expectation.
Yeah. I'm going to guess that home remedy type devices aren't readily made available, or maybe too expensive to institute in homes. I'm thinking, and I don't even know if this would work, but the water softening system that uses osmosis. I forget what it's called, but it's a reverse osmosis type system. Are there any kinds of those devices or methods that can be used by, say, in a remote location where it's a single ranch with a family home and such, or are those not feasible? I don't even know if they exist. Do they even exist?
They do exist.
Okay.
Uh, so there are some communities that are not part of a public water system. So their drinking water isn't going through a standard treatment process. And so in those cases, they're pulling maybe from groundwater. Um, I have colleagues at University of Arizona who's implementing, point of use
Hmm.
filters at the point of um, the tap so that
Wow.
families can have clean water stripped of uranium, for example.
Mm.
So those are available. They're commercially, and that's still, under the research side, but they are commercially available. Brita filters, um, water softeners. In our house, we have an RO system, uh, and so is all that accessible? Not necessarily. It's maybe not necessarily affordable for everyone.
Right.
Um, but that's another place where we do see those inequities is access to clean water.
And as a rule of thumb, EPA or the government agency is not going to be making those available.
No.
It's not something, it would have to be the local community.
Yes.
And as you said, they're often resource strapped.
Hmm.
So that's a challenge. Mm, okay. So other ideas for us that we can share with our faculty and our students of places to look for evidence, I guess, of inequities would be the best way to phrase that.
Yeah. So looking at those databases, I don't know if the community college system has access to research journals.
Hmm.
Um, I think you're going to maybe find a little bit more information there than what's reported on a government website. Um, Locally, if there are, if the instructors wanted to develop activities, there are cheap, affordable water testing kits
Mm,
for water testing. You could test tap water. You could test your own tap water. Look at different water sources. It's always fun, and it gets the students engaged, and they can really see what goes on during the testing process and what results look like.
mm. I'm thinking back to your comment earlier about different communities having different levels of resources. It could be as simple as taking this water testing kit, going into a public facility, say the library, the municipal building, in different locations, taking a water sample and doing some sort of a test on it to determine, give you at least a snapshot
Yes.
of the differences in these different socioeconomic, uh, environments.
Yeah.
That would be kind of interesting. This is fascinating stuff. I'm so happy that we've got smart people like you and your colleagues working on this to solve some of these issues. Um, Maybe just a question more on this demographic. Is there anything else we should know or understand from your research about these disparities? Is there a story behind or a situation that you can share with us that kind of highlights some of these disparities?
I would say, in all of my work with tribal communities, not only on the drinking water side, but the wastewater side, um, I think what's instilled, at least in my culture, is that water is life.
Mm,
It's really important to protect our water resources, make sure everyone has access to clean water, make sure we're not polluting water.
mm,
Um, and so I tend to see a lot of like passion
mm,
from colleagues at the community level to address disparities on the water quality side, because if we can start to eliminate those, then we can start to really look at how it impacts our health.
Have you seen a change, say, over the last, I don't know, 20, 25 years? Have you seen a change in that interest level as more awareness has, as the awareness has grown around the impact of these heavy metals, communities responding with, as you said, higher interest, higher engagement around protecting their water sources?
I feel like I've seen a change just with internet. access to information. More people have more knowledge. They know what questions to ask.
mm,
They know their rights.
mm.
And so I think I've seen more activism on the water side in impacted communities.
Yeah. I wonder if that's a national phenomena because of water issues, impacting we hear a lot about California, about Utah, about Colorado, about
Mhm.
Arizona. You're part of the country as well as in the east and in the central Detroit and the
Mhm.
Michigan. It seems to be everywhere you look. The Everglades, everyone's
Yeah.
kind of focused on this topic. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and we're all dealing, maybe with different issues in each area. But that's really driving, our research, our drive for innovation on the water side, and hopefully that continues.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got one final question for you, and this is a question that our grantor, the Arizona Department of Health Services, is wants to make sure we ask, and that has to do with careers.
Mhm.
So as you're looking at your own career path, what types of options do students have if they want to get engaged in some way in this domain, the big domain? What are the career paths that they might pursue?
So I'm an environmental engineer,
Mm,
and what I love about this field is that it's very multidisciplinary. So you need to know
mm,
a little bit of chemistry, biology, microbiology, public health, definitely mathematics. So as we're looking, to recruit students,
mm,
even community college to our 4-year undergraduate or bachelor's to master's or PhD, um, we're really interested in students who have that passion first off, but who also have those technical skills. Um, at the advanced higher ed levels, we want students with experience
mm.
in the lab because we do a lot of research. We collect those samples and analyze them, and we need to know how to interpret the data. So those basic, STEAM skills are important. But I would say what's even more important is conveying our findings to the public.
Mm,
So, communication, um, making sure you're fine tuning your writing skills, writing a technical report, just
mhm.
being able to talk publicly to a lay person about these complex topics.
Yeah.
Um,
It seems to me in so many instances today, so many of these conversations we've had over the last few weeks, the communication dimension is such, maybe it's been overlooked in the past, or we haven't paid as much attention to it as we have. And what you just said at the end there is being, the ability to be able to take this sometimes complex concepts and put that in a language that a layperson not only understands but can kind of recognize some action they can take is really an important aspect of this whole field.
it's so important because we're doing a lot of important work,
Mm,
and if it's not useful, if our taxpayer population doesn't know what they're funding and it's important, it's significant, then it's really not for anything.
yeah,
And so we definitely have to get this really important information, important facts out to the public in a meaningful way.
yeah, in a way that can be acted upon as well. So
Yes.
as you said, you mentioned public policy, you know, medicine management. There's so much here that has to be addressed in this bigger picture.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. Are there any last thoughts that you'd want to share with our faculty and students as they consider writing their assignments?
Um, if there are any questions, or if you're looking for additional resources, please reach out to me. And if there are, students interested in the field, perhaps maybe they're looking at ASU, to transfer or to go to graduate school, please reach out to me. I'm very much interested in recruiting students with a drive, and maybe even getting students working in my lab.
Yeah. Wow. There's an offer. Thank you
Yes.
so much. Thank you so much.